Good morning. Thank you for joining us today and for our webinar Wednesday for June 2017. Today we are looking at professional and ethical standards. My name's Katie. I'm Digital Services at CABE and I should be looking after you today, moderating the event and dealing with any questions and queries that you may have. So on the right hand side of your screen, or maybe the top of your screen depending on the device or laptop that you're using, there will be a question panel that you can just type in questions, so feel free to send any questions through to us and we'll either answer them as we go along today or we'll pick up those at the end. You can contact us on Twitter, #CABECPD. And our presenter today is Kevin. He's Technical Director at CABE and he'll be talking you through today's webinar. Now some of you may have noticed that the subject matter is slightly different to what we'd originally published, but Kevin will give further explanation to this if you perhaps didn't pick up on any previous correspondence. So I shall hand over to Kevin. Kevin, have you got your presentation on your screen?
I have it on my screen. Just bear with me a second to make sure it's actually working. Okay.
As yet I can't see the presentation, so...
No, it does seem as if the technology is taking a little while to catch up. Whilst the technology is catching up, and you will shortly see the presentation on your screens as soon as my little circle stops buffering, just an explanation of the change of subject. Originally, some of you would have been logged on for a webinar that was going to be about safety at outdoor events, which we'd originally timed to coincide with, if you like, the sort of festival season. We have changed that subject a couple of weeks ago, mainly because in light of recent events we realised that the preparation of the webinar didn't actually include a great deal of information regarding terrorist threats and heightened levels of security. So as a result, the revised webinar with the additional content will drop back into our schedule, and we will be our webinar that we'll be putting on in September time, which I think is round about the 12th, 13th of September, something like that. So that subject matter will return. It will just have more information in it. As you'd appreciate, there's quite a lot of existing and new guidance being issued by the government in relation to those sorts of events, and we will look to incorporate all of that as we go forward. So today we're going to reflect on professional standards within the industry and the obligations we have to clients and those involved in projects, and particularly to end users. And there is an element that within the construction sector, perhaps what should be there that we're perhaps lacking is the same sort of ethical responsibility that already exists within the medical profession. So perhaps for the construction sector, what we need to have is the equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, where we have some baseline principles that everybody in the sector can sign up to and agree to, and that fundamentally start with the same sort of premise perhaps as the medical profession's Hippocratic Oath, in that the first should be first do no harm, and then look at our responsibilities to those involved within the sector and our obligations, both ethical and statutory. So all of us as professionals working within the industry have certain obligations to those within the sector and to other parties involved. Some of that will be contractual obligations, which will include things like confidentiality and privileged information. Some of it will be statutory obligations in terms of standards that we have to meet and obliged to comply with. And then there'll be the ethical and perhaps the professional qualification that run alongside us, that are usually implemented through codes of professional conduct, professional standards that regulate the industry. But again, depending on which professional you are and which body you're a member of, you may have varying standards apply to you, and you may have varying professional qualifications and membership that require a range of behaviours from you. Offset against all of that as well, there is the potential, you know, we are nowadays in a sort of a where there's a blame, there's a claim type culture. So as well as all the obligations we have, there is always in the back of the professional mind, what am I doing to make sure that I avoid any potential claim in the future? and what am I doing, if you like, to cover my own back should anything go particularly wrong? So the first thing I think we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at behaving professionally is, am I just following what it says in the letter of the law, or am I doing what actually is right? And unfortunately, quite often I come across cases where people have acted strictly in accordance with legislation, but the way in which they've gone about doing that has raised some ethical concerns. And I think one of the examples I would give of this would be in legislation such as the Party Wall Act, where obviously there's the ability to represent individuals affected by work. Now, the Party Wall Act makes provision for the appointment of surveyors on behalf of neighbouring properties and for awards to be reached and decisions to be made. And quite a lot is done in terms of working within that legal framework, but it's how the work is engaged in the first instance. And I'm frequently getting members of the public contacting me and saying, I've had this letter from a professional. They've written to me because they've seen an application on the planning register and they're advising me of my rights under the Party Wall Act. And there is an element of that where somebody is physically out looking for work. You've got to take a legitimate way of gaining clients, but sometimes the pressure tactics or the scare tactics that are employed at that point still fit within the legal framework, but ethically and morally perhaps aren't quite as legitimate as maybe other ways of obtaining clients or gaining work. As I said earlier, we are looking at sectors that are quite highly regulated in terms of codes of conduct and standards, and this particular slide sort of reflects the position that probably about 50% of our members find themselves in. Those who work in building control, they normally have an employer's code of conduct which will govern what they can do as an employee of an organisation, and that obviously then would include HR issues and disciplinary codes within that organisation. If they're a professional working in that environment, then they're going to be governed by one of the professional bodies that might cover that sector, such as ourselves or one of the other leading bodies. In addition, then, if they're working within the private sector in building control, there's a regulatory body that basically licenses approved inspectors to practice, which has another code of conduct for those individuals to abide to. And then LABC, as an overarching organisation for local authority building control, have introduced their own voluntary code of conduct as well. So that particular sector has quite a heavy regulatory standard. And within that, the professional bodies I've mentioned there, along now with nearly 120 other professional bodies, have all signed up to an international ethical standards coalition. Now, not all of that 120 bodies are UK based. This is a global initiative to try and come up with some common standards that we can all agree on. And most of the professional bodies working in the construction sector in the UK have now signed up to this international ethical standards coalition. We at CABE have. And the idea is that that then sets proper standards of conduct and behaviour in terms of ethics. And what you will have seen over the last few years is that whilst a lot of professional bodies had codes of professional conduct that govern things like confidentiality, competence to provide services and that sort of thing, a lot of those professional bodies are now altering, adapting or supplementing those codes of conduct with additional ethical standards that need to map into that. We've just done the same sort of exercise ourselves here at CABE, and we will be notifying members of potential changes shortly. But actually, most of what's contained within the International Ethical Standards Coalition was already contained within our existing Code of Professional Conduct. So what are the basic principles that we should be looking to abide by if we are a professional working in the sector? Well, in reality, the key issue is that just because you carry a professional qualification or a member of a professional body does not mean that you can sensibly carry out every element of work that's covered by that qualification. Building engineering covers an awful lot of specialist areas within it, and certainly somebody carrying the professional designation of a chartered building engineer would not necessarily be competent to carry out all of those specialist areas that fall within the breadth of our membership. So it's absolutely fundamentally essential that each professional acknowledges the limits of their own competence and doesn't look to work beyond that competence level unless it's under the supervision of somebody else who is competent. Obviously, you need to at some stage work under supervision to expand your competency if you want to broaden the services you can offer. But we need to make sure that somebody competent is overseeing the process all the way through. And similarly then, as a professional, if you are using third parties to provide some of your services, or you're recommending other consultants, you need to make sure that the people that actually are working under your supervision are competent to do the work that they're intending to do. And you have to take them responsibility for that. So increasingly what we're seeing is not only what is our legal responsibility or our contractual responsibility, but also looking at the issue of protecting the public and looking at things like giving a consideration to social responsibility and to environmental responsibility as well. So if we start breaking it down into some of the elements that are contained within the international standards, in terms of where we sit for things like global responsibility and particularly environmental considerations, you have to consider that in reality there's a whole range of things that could come under this global responsibility banner. Is it about, global warming and the environment? Is it about the way in which we have an impact on our surroundings and wildlife and vegetation? And does that simply mean then that as a professional I shouldn't get involved in anything that has potentially a negative effect? And if that were the case, we wouldn't be building any power stations or anything of that sort. So it's not about not getting involved, it's about recognizing the responsibility and trying to mitigate anything that we are doing, to go back to that first basic principle, if you like, of first do no harm. What we also have to consider then is the other elements that form part of this international standard that we're looking at, and some of that is around confidentiality, some of it is around integrity and responsibility, some of it is about the standard of service that we provide. But a lot of what we're trying to do to be ethical and to operate effectively within the sector is actually being about transparent and communicating effectively exactly what the position is and where our advice and professional design input fits within that framework. So integrity, and I must admit, at sometimes when you're looking for slides and images to represent some of these things, it's difficult to come across, and obviously the burning timber there is purely because integrity has this double meaning in the construction sector as being 1/3 of the elements that go towards fire resistance. But the idea of integrity is it's not just about being honest, it's about going one step further. It's possible to be honest about something whilst at the same time not necessarily conveying the whole picture. And I think this was best described at our last conference by one of the speakers, who said that you can be perfectly honest, but the bit you omit to say, if you like, that goes towards it, that because you're not questioned you don't answer that question, is the bit that maybe relates to integrity. So you can be an honest person but still not necessarily have integrity if you omit to provide information that gives a different view or a contrary view. So it is important that to develop this concept of trust, that you are open and you provide a full range of information as you go through. It's absolutely fundamental for all of the services that any of us provide that we have an element of confidentiality. We owe a confidential trust to our client and to others involved within the process. So we have to observe that confidentiality. We will come across in the course of our work some sensitive information, potentially in relation to business practice and what have you, but we may also come across sensitive information that, on behalf of our client, that shouldn't be passed on to third parties. And it is absolutely essential that in handling information talking to others involved, even in professional networking discussions where you may talk in more general terms, that we observe that confidentiality and we don't share information that it would be inappropriate to do. So the only time that information should be shared specifically is where the client was already given approval to do so. One of the difficult things to try and deal with is always the issue of potential conflicts of interest, differing standards, and to make decisions and present solutions. And it is increasingly the case that we have to look not only at what are we doing as an individual that may create a conflict of interest, but also if we're working employed within an organization that provides a range of services, are we taking steps to make sure that there's no conflict of interest or even the perception of a conflict of interest across the group's responsibilities and services that are offered? So again, reflecting back on the building control sector, there are regulations in place that govern conflicting work and what services can be provided by an organisation that's providing a building control service. But you can still get large organisations that have separate legal identities in terms of companies that fit within the group that offer different professional services. And ultimately, as I say, it's not just about is there a true conflict, it's about the perception of a conflict of interest. And working on that basis, what you have to take a step back and say is, whilst my professional position is that I know that there's no conflict going on, is it possible that in the minds of the client or somebody else involved in the process that they may think that there may be a conflict? And if there's any element like that at the outset of the project, it is important that that potential issue is highlighted to the client so that they can make an informed decision about the appointment at that stage. You'll have read a lot of information in the press recently coming off of the back of the all-party parliamentary group report on excellence in the built environment, the report More Homes, Fewer Complaints, and also the report that's come out particularly looking at the energy sector, which is, you know, every home counts, or each home counts, both of which have highlighted that the sector we're operating in, there is a degree of confusion about the roles of professionals at various stages within that job, and sometimes that can be confused. And the one again that springs to mind is the issue of the building warranty on a new build system, which, if that's being offered by a sister company to the company doing building control, then that potentially looks like there may be confusion in the mind of the client as to who's doing what, particularly as we see fairly frequently if the person actually carrying out the inspections on site for both building control and warranty is actually the same individual, albeit they're wearing two different hats whilst they're carrying out that role. And what's absolutely critical is that there is no undue influence in the decision-making process as that affects how you determine things as a professional, and that anything that might be conceived as being a potential conflict, as I say, is communicated to the parties involved so that they can appreciate and consider the situation themselves. And part of that is about dealing with other professionals, the public, and everybody else involved in the process, and giving them the required level of respect. And again, it's written into a lot of the organisation's code of professional conduct that you should not look to subjugate or to undermine the professional standing of somebody else involved within the process. And as far as possible, you should provide them with the due respect that their professional status and qualification deserves. Clearly, if there are issues in terms of performance and the client needs to be aware of those, then that has to be done. But it has to be done in such a way that it's not just a case of undermining the other person's standing, or particularly in terms of comparing the relative importance of differing qualifications. But as I said earlier on, a lot of this can be overcome by making sure that all the way through the process we are fairly transparent in the information we provide and the way in which we operate. We allow a high level of scrutiny from other parties in the process, so that in effect there is no hidden element, and we're quite open about what we do, which then goes towards the next element, which is embodying a level of trust within the culture. If people, particularly members of the public, they are engaging professionals because they recognize that they don't have the level of expertise and understanding of the construction sector that other people would expect and that professionals will have. So they are putting their trust in the professional involved to represent them and to give them the best possible solution in the process. The difficulty is that obviously everybody involved in the process has to have a level of trust and encourage that to occur. And sometimes you have to balance the responsibility to the client against maybe the responsibility to the end user of the building. And one of the things that sometimes is lacking in this whole process is we have the contractual arrangements between the client and the professional. There'll be a working relationship between the professional and maybe the developer. Sometimes there is a break and a discontinuity between the professional and the actual end user of the building if that isn't going to be the client. And again, there is an element of a duty of care there. And one of the reasons we have professional and ethical standards is to make sure that the public can have the trust in professionals to look after their interests and carry out their work in a professional manner. So in reality, most of those professional bodies that we've mentioned already today, and a good number in the sector, if they are chartered bodies or if they have a charitable status, you will find within their key aims and objectives that one of the key issues is that they have a responsibility to the public. So in addition to the client and the potential end user, there's also a responsibility to the public at large in terms of the impact and the effect on those individuals. So there's a lot of bodies and organisations who put their trust in professionals, and that only works if all of the professionals work to the same sort of standards in the same sort of way. And as a result, the professional bodies have to take very seriously any breaches of their codes of conduct or ethical standards, so that the public can see that this is monitored and that the standards are being maintained. Here at CABE, for the last 5 years or so, our criteria for membership has been based upon a series of key competencies. And most professional bodies have now moved over to this in terms of a means of demonstrating that somebody is competent to practice. And therefore, it's not just a question of somebody holding the right academic qualification or even an academic qualification with a degree of actual practical experience. It is essential that somebody can demonstrate that they are competent to do what they actually aim to do. And as I say, a lot of professional bodies have moved over to this arrangement now. At CABE, we have our own standards of competence and criteria to meet. We also work very closely with the Society for the Environment, for those of our members who are chartered environmentalists, and they have a very similar but slightly different competency framework. And we are a professional affiliate of the Engineering Council, and we have in mind that they have their own standards and criteria of competence. And as far as we're concerned at CABE, competence is built up of several elements, some of which are about having the base level of understanding and knowledge, but more importantly, it's about how that knowledge and understanding is applied in practice. And then alongside that, there are issues about professional methods of working, communication, and ethical responsibility. But competence isn't just something that's achieved as and when somebody joins a professional body, or once they've got an academic qualification under their belt and they've practiced for a couple of years. Competence has to be maintained. and actually written into our Royal Charter is a requirement for our chartered members to maintain their level of competence, which means carrying out continuing professional development, or CPD. Now, the correct level of continuing professional development is always debatable, and most organisations will measure CPD and monitor CPD in terms of hours of activity undertaken or units accredited. But in actual fact, somebody's requirement for CPD will change throughout their professional career. In the early stages, as things are still developing and the career is growing, there'll be quite a high demand. Somebody in the later stages of their career may have a lesser demand in terms of attaining new knowledge, other than obviously to reflect the changes and the changing technology and the processes and the methods of construction that are happening within the sector. But it certainly is the case that to maintain that level of competence and to maintain a professional qualification and to meet the professional and ethical standards, it's necessary to carry on developing throughout your career to keep up with the changes that are happening. Right, I'm just going to drop back and pick up on a comment that's been made. Just really acknowledging that it's interesting to say that there's a focus on transparency as a quality now. Its origin in terms of characteristic wasn't necessarily integrity based, and yes, it is quite clear in there are 10 elements to the international standard of ethics, and transparency is in there as a key element. And it's difficult because there has to be a balance. You have to be transparent in what you do in your professional behaviour and how you deal with other individuals, but at the same time you do have to balance that against the need for a level of confidentiality. So as being as open as possible whilst not sharing information that falls within that confidential nature. And then responsibility. So everyone within the process has a level of responsibility to everybody else within the process. It's not just about how we deal with the client or the end user. It is about the responsibility of everything throughout the process. I suppose the mind focuses the responsibility to a certain extent with things like the CDM, Construction Design and Management Regulations, where we recognise that what we do at the design stage, or that input in the design team, has an impact on the safety and well-being of everybody else throughout the process. But there is a joint responsibility, not only of the individual professional, but of everybody involved, to come to a solution that meets a need and is suitable. And this is where a degree of collaboration, communication, networking, sharing information can help to improve that joint understanding of the responsibility of the end user. And it's interesting to note that actually that the use of BIM on projects, although it's mainly a tool to prevent clashes and errors and reduce conflicts that could be predicted before they get to site and require remedial work, the sharing and communication side of BIM is helping to spread the concept of who's responsible for what area, and where that collective responsibility has a role to play in terms of protecting the end user. And alongside the sort of general responsibilities, and as I've mentioned, they're things like health and safety, professionals end up at some stage with an element of financial responsibility as well. Theoretically, at every stage during the design of a building, the designer should be looking at all of the potential options and choices at that point and coming to a conclusion as to what is the most appropriate, but also what is the most cost effective for the client. And certainly on projects where there is a quantity surveyor involved, again, the same sort of thing should be being carried out to look at the professional and the financial responsibility at that point. And it's important at the early stages to set the ground rules for the financial performance of the project, and to monitor and provide that information back all the way through the process to the client and those actually footing the bill for the whole project. So I guess the question then is, when we're designing a project, when we're working as part of the design team, whether we're looking at it from a building control perspective, where we're managing the project on site, what are we actually looking at in terms of the standard we're trying to achieve? And one of the things that increasingly is of concern is that within the UK, for a lot of what we do in the construction sector, we have some minimum statutory requirements. And it's a little bit unfortunate that over recent years, actually what tends to have happened is the minimum requirement that we see, which sits either as a recognised industry standard or as a building regulation or a building standard in Scotland, that minimum standard unfortunately is reverted to be what is the target that we're trying to achieve. And as a result then, because our target is a minimum standard of compliance, more often than not, we don't necessarily hit that target. Now, although I've put on the slide minimum statutory requirement, it is worth bearing in mind that actually sometimes the minimum requirement isn't set by statute. It may well be set either by the client, or it might be set, and typically is for complex buildings, by the eventual insurers and the standards that they're looking at in terms of protection of the asset, if you like. So it might be going over and above a statutory requirement. But again, we're still trying to hit a minimum target that's been set by somebody. And I think what's missing from the sector is, alongside those minimums, a communication and a sharing of actually not what is the minimum that we can get away with, what's the minimum standard we can say meets our requirement, but also actually what is the sort of best practice, not necessarily aiming to always achieve the exemplar level that the industry sets, but actually what is really good best practice. And I think at the moment that's where we tend to sit, is we have a minimum level of compliance. We have the projects that go through that do set up for an exemplar status, win awards, get the press at the other extreme. And what's missing is the sort of middle of the road. This is what we should be doing, that sits somewhere between those for the vast majority of the projects that we're involved with. What represents something better than minimum as a sort of a best practice to aim for. The other issue, I think, that affects whether something performs and how it fits within the expectations is that the clients on the projects now tend to expect a much greater level of performance of the end project. There is far less tolerance in the client side of modern buildings for faults and defects at the handover stage of the building. 40, 50 years ago, people moved into new build properties, and if there was shrinkage, cracking, and there was a little bit of movement, it was tolerated. It was understood that that's how a building would be. Nowadays, people have an expectation that everything is going to be perfect. And this is why the industry is tending to look at other ways of achieving the standard, by looking at things like off-site or factory constructed buildings. Because the expectation in every other walk of life is that what you buy as a brand new product will be perfect at day one and may deteriorate from that point on, but at the point at which you buy it, it's perfect. Be it a widescreen TV or a brand new car or whatever, it's expected to be perfect at day one. And there's an element in the client expectation of why should we settle for something less at the beginning of a project once we get that brand new building, other than something that is absolutely perfect. So there's an education process there in setting a client's expectation at the beginning, and it sort of comes back to the old marketing adage that at the beginning of the project, if you under-promise and then over-deliver, the client is always going to be satisfied, whereas at the beginning of the project you make unreasonable predictions in terms of what's achievable, and then you don't attain those, the client is going to be disappointed. So a lot of it again is about communication, getting those messages over to the client at the early stages. And then ultimately all of this comes down to our duty of care to those involved in the process. So we have to make sure that in the design and construction process, we do have in mind all of the other people involved in the process, the client, the end user, the public, anybody else involved or affected by our actions and what we're constructing. And as long as we follow that through, then there's a good chance we're going to meet the overall package of our obligations as a professional. Now, part of the reason that we've run through today's webinar is because we have made slight changes to our Code of Professional Conduct and Ethical Standards in the association. Those changes are at the moment are in a draft format, but subject to approval by the board of directors of the association. We will shortly be running out to members details of the revised standard, and we'll be asking members to consider when they renew their subscription in the autumn of this year to sign up to the new standard, which isn't in effect putting a lot of additional obligation on them. It's not involving any extra paperwork, but it's reflecting where the industry perhaps should be. And here at the Chartered Association of Building Engineers, what we're trying to do is take a lead on this issue rather than simply follow what everybody else is doing. Right, now I appreciate this has been a slightly shorter webinar than some of the ones we've put forward, and as I say, it was on a change of subject, so I do appreciate those of you who decided to stick with us and join in for today. I'm now going to just ask if you have any further questions or any comments or anything you'd like us to consider within this. If you could pop those into the question box, it would be appreciated. And then other than that, if there is nothing else that's going to come in, I'm going to hand back to Katie to just sum up and advise of what was coming up soon. So, okay, Katie, over to you.
Great, thank you, Kevin. As Kevin has just said, if you've got any questions, then feel free to quickly type away before we wrap up this session. But our next webinar that we've got scheduled is on the 12th of July, and it's designing to minimise the risk and impact of arson. So that's the next subject that we're looking for. And then what we're going to do, have our usual break over the summer, so we won't hold a webinar Wednesday in August, but we'll then be back in September. And as Kevin said at the beginning, and also just touched on then, we will be then looking to put in the revised content for the safety at large-scale and outdoor events. We'll be doing that in September. Not available to register onto it yet, but I will get that hopefully available by next week, so you can just re-sign back up for it next week. And then we're also looking at the subjects to cover in the autumn. We've got a few ideas, but we always ask for any opinions or any things that you want us to hear, you want to hear us cover. We don't have to stick to the same subjects. We can go down different routes. So if there's perhaps certain areas, perhaps a little bit more sort of off-piste than we normally cover, then again, get in touch and we'll see if we can build some content around them. And alternatively, we are looking at mixing things up a bit, perhaps getting some different people to speak, because obviously Kevin is our super expert and does it every month. But if anybody is out there that would actually like to get involved in delivering webinars with us, then of course we would absolutely love to hear from you. So I can see, Kevin, there's things popping in now. Thank you all ever so much. There are just
a few comments and questions coming in, which I will just pick up as we have got a little bit of time to deal with them. There's a question about, with the changes in ethical standards, is there an intention for CABE to become a regulatory body? Well, in reality, in terms of our own professional membership, we do act as a regulatory body. We have codes of conduct, and obviously there is disciplinary processes if people don't follow those codes of conduct. So to a certain extent, that's where we sit within our own instance. We do also contribute to other overarching organisations' codes as well. What we don't do at the moment is we don't regulate practices and companies, because the association is concerned with individual professional memberships. So that is something we're thinking about, but obviously there's an awful lot of work to do before we could go down that route. And the other quick comment that's come in is ethics in relation to attendance in court and expert witness work. I think the key difference, if you are attending a court as an expert witness, then obviously in terms of where your professional obligation lies, your obligation then actually lies with the responsibility of the court to present a professional view without any bias from one side or the other. And it's important when doing that work that as an expert witness, that sort of status means that you're not then unduly influenced by one side or the other in terms of where we go. There's a couple of other comments coming in about future potential webinars, and that's useful because we'll pick that up and go forward. And just to pick up on what's on the slide there, if you do have any comments about what you'd like to see in future webinars, get in touch with us, drop us an email, and we will then try and drop that into our future program. Okay, just back to you then, Katie, just to say goodbye, I think.
Thank you, Kevin. And yeah, that's kind of it really. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the subject. We can see some good feedback coming in from what people have said based on the content today. So have a good rest of the day, and we will see you hopefully online next month. Thank you very much.